5 years in Kenya, burying at least 350 people with them and injuring hundreds more. It's becoming such a big issue, and everyone's asking who is to blame and what can we do to stop this from happening. In studio, we're joined by Waweru Gadesha, who is the chair of the Architectural Association of Kenya. Thank you so much for coming. And then we have Professor Alfred Omenya, who is a construction expert. Thank you both so much for coming. So obviously a lot of blame games going on at this point. Who is to blame, etc. As experts in this field, and perhaps I can start with you, Waweru, what exactly is the biggest issue here? It may seem obvious, you know, in terms of just the quality of the buildings, etc. But what for you is the biggest issue and your biggest concern?
Thank you, Janet. I think the biggest issue, if you ask me, is the absence of political will to enforce well-known policy. Policy is law, it's regulations, it's standards. If we could overcome the absence of political will, then I think we would be on the highway to mending the problems you cited. Okay. That for me is the biggest problem, single biggest problem.
All right.
Yes.
Would you share the same?
Yes, I agree fully, Janet. But I just want to add that I think in Kenya, and that's very personal to me, we do not take life seriously. I think for me what is really, really critical, even with the policies and the laws and the regulations, is that the policymakers and those who are enforcing regulations must come to the realization that every life of every single Kenyan is important, and we should not play around with it. So I think if we start from there, then we start seeing the enormity of the issue at hand, and also we start looking at the seriousness of the solutions.
And perhaps even taking it a lot more seriously than a lot of people think it's been taken now. In Nairobi, who has to authorize and supervise construction?
In all counties and previously in all municipalities, that mandate was with the municipal council before the city council of Nairobi, and currently the county government. There's no ambiguity about the government agency that is directly responsible for regulation of the entire built environment within the city. So definitely it is the county government, right?
You're supposed to see that. And which body verifies competence and registers contractors in Kenya? Perhaps I could throw that at you. And
right. The body that registers contractors is the National Construction Authority, established in via the National Construction Authority Act 2011. So it's a fairly recent act. Previously, contractors were registered administratively in what was then the Ministry of Public Works, now Ministry of Land, Housing, Urban Development. Okay.
Yeah.
Just to touch on something Professor said, the state is responsible for the safety of human beings. The state has power, eminent domain and development control. Power in regards to land, and anything that's development is land. The power of development control, okay, is then given to local authorities in the past and now county governments. I will call them local planning authorities. They have the power to control development, to say this can happen here in this manner and this cannot happen, period. There is no ambiguity.
Right. Okay. And in your view, the discrepancies lie somewhere there.
Correct.
Would you say that?
Somewhere in there.
Yeah,
Correct.
somewhere in there.
Exactly.
You don't want to go into specifics. At what stages should a building be inspected when under construction?
In fact, after the approval process and you start your construction, typically the consultants are there from the client side to actually supervise that building throughout. But the state enforcement agencies are actually meant to have periodical supervision, and this is critical, especially, for example, in the case of Huruma, to ensure that what was approved is actually what is built. And should there be any changes, both to the structure and the architectural layout of this, the state does have, in this instance, the county government does have the instruments to deal with that, including stopping that construction. And the ultimate end of this particular supervision is to say that you have built a building that, according to these agencies, according to the county government, meets the requirement for human habitation, and at that point you get certificate for occupation. So even if I did buildings throughout and it was supervised and somehow government is convinced that is not up to the standards, even late in the day, government does have the instruments to stop the occupation of that building.
Absolutely.
The law is there. Right.
Okay. You're agreeing, obviously, with that?
Right. Absolutely, absolutely. There are two stages of approval. There is the construction permit. You want a building, you go to somebody competent, an architect, an engineer, and they submit drawings to the local planning authority. Okay? You get your construction permit. You go through the project. At the end of the project, this house is complete as designed, as stated in the document we submitted. The local planning authority will require you to give certificates of workmanship, will require you to state this building is built as per the standards, as per the regulations, and any modifications within certain parameters declared, and then you get your occupation certificate. Two stages.
Okay.
There's, again, no doubt, no confusion, there's no vacuum anywhere.
Correct.
Okay. Are these laws sufficient? Are the laws sufficient, and are they punitive enough in your view? Especially for people who are defaulting on these, what you've talked about.
The laws are sufficient. The laws are punitive. I think the problem is enforcement of the laws themselves. The regulations are quite punitive. In fact, and my chairman here would vouch for this, a normal professional practicing, particularly in the city of Nairobi, feels the weight of the law quite a bit. I've got enforcement officers coming to my sites quite regularly, incidentally. And I think that is not where the problem is. But I keep asking myself that on a site where there's no professional at all, where the contractor is some fellow, walking around town with a hammer, with no known qualification and no certification, and buildings go up fully. So it seems like we're focusing on the wrong on the wrong person, on the wrong thing. The professional has adequate instruments of dealing with the professional, and in case of a disaster, there are adequate protection of both the investor, their workers, and the works. We have quite a number of insurances and so on that protect me as a professional. But the big problem is that the city is not being built by professionals.
By quacks. It's being built by quacks, would you say that?
So the issue is not to wait for me and Bwanagadesha here to take their plans and then get problems with approval. The issue is to get these other fellows who are building in total disregard to the law and basically take action.
And
I think that's the problem.
How do we do that?
Janet, a society has to decide how it wants to live. Okay? If you decide you're a lawbreaker, then it'll be pretty much impossible if all of us were lawbreakers for us to have adequate capacity, okay, or policemen or inspectors to follow each one of us. But let me go back and say that if we really cared, if we really cared as a society, we would not have the problems we have. Right? Somebody cleverer than me once said, where societal mores are insufficient, laws are ungovernable. Where they're sufficient, laws are unnecessary. Okay? Yes, we could have better legislation. Everywhere could have better legislation. But the clear point is that we do have adequate legislation. It could be improved for a fact. The legislation we have is adequate to produce many of the buildings you see in Nairobi, all over Kenya, that are upright, that don't collapse, that have been there for 100 years. Right. Those are the same laws that govern what we see as perhaps uninhabitable or dangerous structures. Okay? So the laws are there. The will to implement them and to enforce standards is what I call the absence of political will.
Right, that's what you mentioned earlier on.
Right.
And let me just add there, because I've been able to frame this in the past. We are coming from a past where we have three approaches to enforcement of regulations and laws. And one of them is what I call absence of government. There are places, if you look at, for example, at informal settlements in this country, traditionally, government has been absent there. So people do whatever they actually want to do. And forget about the collapsing buildings. We have fires in informal settlements every week. Yes, so there's no government. People do whatever they want to do. Government doesn't bother. And then we have abstinence of government. There are areas where government can actually regulate. But for whatever reason, for lack of capacity, for lack of will, again, and so on, government does not. And in this discussion we're having, a huge chunk of Eastlands would be there. If you look at, I call them the leaning towers of Umoja. If you look at Kayole, a disaster waiting to happen. If you look at Kasarani, if you look at Ruaka, if you look at Dandora.
So even as we speak, there's massive disasters waiting to happen. Would you say that?
Of course. Yeah. In fact, whatever's happened is a tip of the iceberg. The disaster has not happened. In fact, it hasn't. The disaster is what we see in all these areas, in Mukuru. Huge high-rise buildings that have been built, using substandard materials, wherever. But what is government doing there? There, I call it abstinence, because government can actually intervene, but doesn't. And then, of course, we have the places where there's presence of government. How many buildings have collapsed in the city center, for example? Or in Uplands? Or in Westlands.
Yeah, you don't see that.
In those places, there is government and there is adequate enforcement.
And there's adequate regulation.
Correct.
As well.
So what we need is to get government everywhere. Yeah. Both in the instances where government has been abstaining and in places where government has been absent, where government has left it to the rats.
Maybe along the same lines, a study has shown, a study that was released, that 80% of buildings in Nairobi are at risk of collapse. Is that an exaggeration? Is there truth to it? You just said this is a disaster, a tip of the iceberg, but 80%?
I think without knowing the study or having perused it, perhaps not 80%. I think the governor today said slightly less than 70%. The point is, and I would ask that we shift this discussion or broaden it to habitable dwellings.
Right.
Structural collapse is the worst manifestation, or is the most dramatic manifestation. Okay? When you live in a building, we're in a studio right now, when you live in your apartment block, you want clean water, you want amenity. Amenity is light, amenity is all the good things, services, infrastructure, okay? You want to be able to open your tap, good quality water, flush your toilet, and do that repeatedly, you and your family, okay? You want rights to light, you want rights to clean air. The number of buildings that don't comply with a minimum standard for a habitable dwelling is the standard, is the number of dwellings that Professor is talking about, okay? It's not just structural collapse. Structural collapse is one component, it just happens to be fairly dramatic.
Right.
But I'll go back again. Are we a lawful society? We commiserate with those who've lost lives, of those who've had relatives injured, but we're generally a lawless society, if you ask me. And it's a culture, it's systemic, it's endemic. In Makongeni, I think 6-7 people passed away. Okay, bless their souls, and others were injured. But hardly a week goes by, a bus has rolled into something somewhere. Accidents happen all over the places. I've seen something on Twitter this evening. There's a fire in Mlolongo. Okay, if you've ever been into Mlolongo, you wonder how people live. Okay. Mlolongo, I believe, is a special planning area right now. I first went into Mlolongo 15 years ago. Small single-story buildings. Right now, I don't know what to call it. It's a disaster. It's a disaster, and there's no other name for it. There's no absence of what should be done, how it should be done, who should do it. There's enough precedents, there's enough case studies, and that's what they send people to architecture school to do, to engineering school, to planning school.
Okay, I have one or two more questions before we wind up. One is that obviously these buildings are being designed and constructed. Do we know the people behind it? I know you mentioned that there's quacks, there's not a lot of professionals, but do we know them, and do we know if any action has been taken against them? If these same people continue to build and construct and design these buildings, where are they, who are they, and what's been done about them?
Yes, Janet, I mean, what you're asking is very interesting, because sorry for using this illustration, because I think this is a very serious discussion. But we used to say in the School of Architecture that the difference between architects and doctors is that doctors can bury their mistakes. A building is quite a big structure. It's quite hard to hide it or to build it in secret. It's quite, especially when you're looking at 7 stories, 8 stories, it's quite difficult not to see it being built. And even for what has been built, it requires very basic technology to be able to document that whole hog. every single building in Nairobi, there are not that many buildings in Nairobi if you compare this with the mega cities and so on. It is possible, it is doable to actually document every single building in this city and be able to say, okay, fine, this meets the threshold and this does not. And to me, I think that's the issue. If you're waiting for the quacks to go to City Hall to put in the applications, that will not happen in the next century. But what must we do? We need to do an audit, and some of these things have been suggested in the past. We need to do an audit of all the buildings in the city. And from there, we'll quickly know what is habitable and what is not, regardless of whether they're approved or not. Because it's quite possible to do a building which is not approved but which is actually sound.
All right.
Yeah. And immediately we are able to do that, then immediately we can actually be able to prescribe action.
Yeah.
We can say this must be demolished because they don't meet the requirements. These ones can be approved administratively because although the professionals were not involved in them, according to professional opinion, they're actually habitable.
Okay.
And then, of course, they're the ones which meet the requirement.
Right.
And the other thing that we must look at, and again, I'm now speaking directly to county government. County government does need help, like the previous councils and so on. And across the whole country, they will not sort this matter themselves. They will not get enough enforcement officers to do the job. They need to quite quickly start engaging those who are here like us for the rest of our lives.
Okay, I'll have to leave it at that from you, Professor. Thank you so much. I'll take that as your parting shot. Your parting shot.
My parting shot is very simple, Janet. Political will. I want to applaud the statements by His Excellency the President. He's requested an audit of all buildings in Nairobi. It shouldn't just be Nairobi, it should be the whole of Kenya. Kenyans live everywhere, okay? That audit, 3 months, there should be a report, there should be actions. This is the government of Kusema na Kutenda. I want to recognize the efforts of the governor of Nairobi. He's taken some actions today. We hope that that's the beginning of a sustainable solution. Window dressing is uninteresting. Okay, there's been collapses, like you mentioned, many of them. I have sat in task forces before, and I'm going to sit in a new task force. There must be action. Okay, there must be action. Otherwise, what is guaranteed is those buildings are gravity defying. You cannot defy gravity.
All right.
Very simple.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insight. Stay with us. We're back after the break with some of your business news.